Good afternoon, everyone. Seeing everybody filing into our virtual lecture hall this afternoon. All right, give about a couple more seconds to let everybody in. And we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our March RC lecture. I'm Lisa Radici, RC's US Director, and I'm so glad to have you with us this afternoon. And I will be honored to introduce Dr. James Hoffmeier, who will delight us shortly with his presentation, Tutankhamun and the Amarna Period on Egypt's Eastern Frontier. But before I introduce Dr. Hoffmeier, I want to take a moment and extend a special welcome to all of our RC members tuning in from all across the globe. And if you are not already an RC member and are interested in joining, of course, I invite you to visit our website, rc.org, to join and learn more. And all of our RC members enjoy a suite of benefits ranging from a new benefit of flight discounts on Egypt Air to our Scribe magazine and our monthly private member-only lectures. And our next lecture coming up is actually a special edition public lecture, which will be on April 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern, entitled Giving Life to the Stones, a Philanthropic Partnership to Celebrate a Living Culture in the City of the Dead. And this lecture will focus on RC's work at Bassettine Cemetery in partnership with the Karaite Jews of America and the Drop of Milk Foundation. So if you've been following RC's progress at that site, or you may recall it as our cover story from the last Scribe magazine edition, you won't want to miss it. It's going to be a really special presentation. And of course, a plug for our upcoming 73rd annual meeting, which will be, of course, in Irvine, California this year, April 22nd through the 24th. We are so glad to be back in person after 2 years of being virtual. So there's still time to register. Please join us if you can in person. The hotel room blocks discount is good until April 4th. So make sure to make your reservations. And of course, if you cannot join us in person, we are hosting a separate virtual annual meeting May 6th through 8th, which will also feature new presentations, and virtual registrants will also have access to any lectures that were recorded during the in-person meeting. And if you attend the in-person meeting, you will also receive access to the virtual meeting. So we hope to see you either in California or virtually. So now I would like to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon, Dr. James Hoffmeier. We're so pleased to have you with us. So Dr. Hoffmeier is Emeritus Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at Trinity International University's Divinity School. And he was born and raised in Egypt, so his passion for archaeology began in his youth, which led him to major in Near Eastern Archaeology at Wheaton College. His graduate school took him to the University of Toronto, where he earned both his master's and PhD in Egyptology and worked on the Akhenaten Temple project's excavations at East Karnak. From 1980 to 1999, he served on the faculty of Wheaton College, and from 1999 to 2019, he was teaching at Trinity. He directed the North Sinai Archaeological Project from 1994 to 2008 and has published 2 volumes of final reports from the work at el-Borg, which were published in 2014 and 2019. So Dr. Hoffmeier has authored and edited 20 books, written more than 100 articles in journals, books, dictionaries, and encyclopedias, and is also the author of Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hoffmeier.
Well, good afternoon, and for some of you, good evening. Welcome from me. I am in Paradise, Pennsylvania, where life is wonderful and it's always sunny and pleasant, at least some days. The topic of my lecture, Tutankhamun and the Amarna Period on Egypt's Eastern Frontier, has now sprouted a little addition, some implications. So let's go. Right. When we think of Tutankhamun, and especially this important centennial year, we can't help but think of the wonderful objects found in his tomb. And of course, one could spend a lifetime just studying these marvelous objects. But what is often forgotten when we think of this youthful king who reigned about a decade is that other things were going on, not just making wonderful furnishings for his tomb. Tutankhamun comes to us late in the 18th dynasty. And of course, he was the recipient of an impressive empire that was built on the shoulders of warring kings like Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV. The Egyptian empire stretched way south into Nubia, the Fifth and Sixth Cataract areas, and north all the way to the southern borders of the Hittite Empire in Cilicia, as this map shows. When we think of Tutankhamun, of course, we place him in the Amarna era, even though he is sort of one who tried to distance himself from the religious reforms of Akhenaten. And to many, of course, this often the religious aspect of the reign of Akhenaten is what captivates so many people, including me, which is why I wrote the aforementioned book, Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism. Our focus today is not going to be on the religious aspects, but more on the political and diplomatic aspects of the Amarna period and the time of Tutankhamun. We all know the Tut restoration stela from Karnak, now in the Cairo Museum, reports of the efforts of the young king to restore things back to orthodoxy after the heresy of Akhenaten, and how he restored temples and so on and so forth. One little line in the restoration stela that historians have looked at is the claim that when in the previous period, when the armies of Egypt went out, they were not successful. And this has contributed to the view that the great empire that Egypt had carved out in Western Asia was somehow lost or diminished significantly because of Akhenaten's policies. And so it has become quite common for historians, Egyptologists, to think of the 19th dynasty and the Ramesside kings as one of restoring Egypt's former glory and expanding the empire to its original status. John Wilson said, Seti I set out in his first year to recapture the Asiatic empire. And more recently, Jaap van Dyke said, it was now essential to reassert Egyptian authority over these areas. So the sense is that Akhenaten had somehow let it all go. And this, of course, was not the view held by everyone. 60 years ago in Jarsey, Alan Schulman described the popular sentiment of his day, and then, of course, we'll reject it. But here's what he said. It has been assumed by most scholars that the loss of Egypt's Asiatic empire was due mainly to the combination of the indolent pacifism of Akhenaten and his intense preoccupation with his religious innovations. But then he goes on to say, it is the present writer's belief that there was no break in the Amarna period with the earlier military traditions of the dynasty, and that the army, far from being the mute instrument of the crown, actually became so powerful that it installed its own leaders on the throne. And here he was thinking of Horemheb, Ramses I, who were all military people. So his line here, there was no break in Amarna period with the earlier military traditions, is really what I'm aiming to underscore based on archaeological evidence that I was able to adduce from our excavations. More on that below. The reign of Amenhotep III, the grandfather of Tutankhamun, of course, is recognized to be the zenith of the 18th dynasty. Again, Sir Alan Gardner that Egypt attained the zenith of its magnificence through the celebrity of this king is not founded on any military achievement. More recently, Ariel Kozlov says Amenhotep III was for 38 years the richest man on earth and commander-in-chief of the largest, best-equipped army of his day, a successful though infrequent warrior of what is often called Egypt's golden age, or the Pax Aegyptiaca. So when we come to the reign of Amenhotep III, we come to this place of great wealth and prosperity in Egypt, and everything seems to be going just fine. And then it's as if somehow it is thought that Akhenaten came along and blew it all. But it's interesting to see that the period of Amenhotep III, and I'm going to argue continues into the Amarna period, was one of diplomacy, treaties, and peace with the Levant and Mesopotamia. These were the efforts that were underway with Amenhotep III, and I would suggest this was what Akhenaten tried to continue. Again, one is often distracted by the religious reforms of Akhenaten, and as Schulman pointed out almost 60 years ago, this has led people to think he was sort of overlooking the political and the military aspects of his era. So my question is, other than Atenism, the religious dimension, what really changed under Akhenaten in terms of foreign policy, in terms of international diplomacy? I maintain it's sort of a little bit like father, like son. Akhenaten built temples extensively, just as Amenhotep III built extensively. No fewer than 4 edifices were constructed by Akhenaten at Karnak prior to the move to Amarna. He built an entire new city, and Talatat blocks from Aten temples have been found as far north and into Sinai as Tel el-Borg, more on that below. They've been found at Heliopolis, Memphis, Asyut, Abydos, Achmim, and way down into Nubia at Kerma and Gebel Barkal. So Akhenaten was building all over the place. So in a sense, he's maintaining his father's tradition of being a great builder. Diplomacy that had characterized Amenhotep III's reign continued as reflected in the Amarna letters. Letters were going back and forth between Egypt and vassal states and large kingdoms, be they the Babylonians or the Hittites and so on. But battles were fought, and there is ample evidence that Akhenaten was not just sitting back passively watching things go by. The big issue that seems to change around 1350 and maybe a little bit before 1350 BC was the rise of the Hittites, and thus Egypt's status quo, the control of the northern part of its empire, was now being challenged. This area had been quietly controlled by Egypt and Mitanni, that is North Syria. And during this period, probably during Akhenaten's reign, the city of Kadesh was lost to Egyptian control. But the point seems to be, at the end of the day, I think the issue was the rise of Hittite power more than the negligence of Akhenaten's military. It's been long known, going back almost 100 years, that the French discovered at Medamud, near Karnak, near Thebes, the Talatat fragments of a battle in which Egyptian forces are shown fighting against Hittite forces in what Alan Schulman called the First Hittite War. At Karnak, Redford's efforts identified a number of Talatat blocks, once again, with North Syrians and possibly Hittites shown based on the kind of helmets that are being worn. And these were published by Alan Schulman in Akhenaten Temple Project Volume 2. And here he expanded on what he called the Second Hittite War. So we know from these Talatats at Karnak that were built in the first 2 to 3 years of Akhenaten's reign. Certainly by year 5, the temples would have been completed, and he had moved in the following year to Akhenaten, his new capital. So it's very clear that early in his reign, there was some sort of battle in North Syria, one might think, to at least a show of force against the Hittites, who were beginning to make their presence known. Additionally, we have the temple blocks discovered by Ray Johnson. And these, of course, again, show a battle against North Syrians and Hittites. And again, the clue here is the type of helmets and the kind of shields being used by these enemy warriors. And then we also have the famous decoration scene in which Akhenaten and Nefertiti are offering the gold of valor to General Horemheb after his military activities. In this case, a military campaign into Nubia, but there is also textual reference in the tomb to Horemheb's engagement in North Syria. So all of this makes it clear that Akhenaten was militarily active and not just sitting at Akhenaten smoking weed and writing poetry, as sort of a 60s version of Akhenaten would have him look like. I would refer you to Emmeline Healy's doctoral dissertation, Akhenaten and the Armed Forces, the Military and Police Within Egypt in the Late 18th Dynasty. This was a dissertation at Monash University from 2012, supervised by Colin Hope, and I was the external examiner. If you can get a hold of this, it does bring together a lot of this material about the military, and I think she comes to the conclusion, as did Schulman, that there really is no military withdrawal in the Amarna period. In fact, it might be argued that Akhenaten really counted on the military to support his efforts. Now, I want to take you to North Sinai, or the northeastern frontier of Egypt, to this area in this red box. This is where we lived and worked for a good number of years. And it was within this area that, before we ever started excavating at el-Borg, I was committed to trying to understand the paleo environment, trying to understand what this frontier area was like in antiquity. And this began with an augering project between the sites of Hebwa I and Hebwa II, now recognized to be the fortresses of Charu. We were engaged in drilling and collaboration with the Geological Survey of Egypt, Dr. Bahagayed, shown here, supervising a drilling rig, as we tried to piece together with the geological team what this area was like. We were also benefited from the use of satellite imagery, in particular, Corona satellite images that in 1992 were declassified. These are 1960s era photographs, this in particular 1967. And you can see here the area in that red box I showed you just a moment ago, the Suez Canal on the left. In the center was an ancient lagoon, and you can see the coastline from the New Kingdom and earlier. In time, the delta is going to build out and move north. But at this point in history, the New Kingdom, the area looked something like this. You can see the military sites of Hebwa I and Hebwa II. Here is Tel el-Borg. We also discovered in our geological work a Nile branch that flowed right by Tel el-Borg and emptied into this lagoon. The lagoon has been identified by Manfred Bitok as early as Tel Adaba Volume 2 as the lake called Shihor. This was the waters of Horus, known to us from Papyrus Anastasi III and other Ramesside era texts. Now, here is a more recent satellite image, a Google Earth image, and you can see here on the top the outline of the fort exposed by Dr. Muhammad Abdul Maqsood of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. That's the first fort, and here is the second fort, or Hebwa II, which is the fortress of Charu, the Chetem fort. And in between these forts is the area where we did our augering, and just below the sands, the sands gave way to Nilotic mud and shells, And it made it very clear that there was a Nile channel that flowed between these forts, precisely as is displayed on the Seti I Karnak reliefs on the north side of the hypostyle hall. Now here's a map that maybe allows you to see this area a little more clearly. You see Hebwa 1, Hebwa 2, and basically the route one would have to take to go off on a military campaign to Canaan and Syria, going around the lake or lagoon and then heading east to Gaza. So this gives you an idea of the importance of this zone for the security of Egypt's eastern frontier. At Tel el-Borg, clearly one of these military sites on the road around the ancient lagoon, the waters of Shihor, we found two forts, one of the 18th dynasty, and you're looking here, looking down on a moat. The moat, an amazing, unique structure, to my knowledge, where red fired brick is used in the foundations on a scale that I don't think has been found elsewhere for the 18th dynasty. On the left side is the outside, and the inside, the inside is on the left, the outside of the moat is on the right. But I wanted to call your attention to the chips of limestone that you see here that filled in this moat. This is an intentional fill. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here's our colleague, the late Jim Knudstedt, who was involved in the excavation of this remarkable feature. On the north side, the walls of this moat were badly deteriorated, as you can see here. And it's very clear to us that the deterioration was due to flooding. You can see the mud indicating how the superstructure walls of the moat were melted down by water, and you can see how it all collected here at the end of the wall. So what we have is the red outline of the 18th dynasty fort, we believe made by Thutmose III, or certainly Amenhotep II. And then on the right, you'll see the brown outline of what was the second, or what we call the Ramesside fort. At the north end of the fort is where we have a Nile channel that I mentioned we had discovered previously. We believe that what had happened is, perhaps due to a series of high Niles, the whole back wall of this fort was compromised and destroyed. We could find no evidence of this marvelous moat at the back end of the fort, and the flooded out areas were right here towards the end on both sides. We found flood damage to the fort. Now, when did this all happen? We go back to the moat that I showed you cleared out earlier, but here you can see it in excavation, piles of broken limestone fragments, including larger pieces, some of which were collected for this picture. In this remote location in the desert, limestone had to be transported from the limestone cliffs around Cairo. And so to ship all this material out here came at a great cost. And for it to be just chopped up and thrown into a garbage refuse to fill up a moat seems like really bad use of an important building material. And we have a number of blocks out at Sinai, which we could see were recycled and used 3 different times. So why all this was just dumped into the moat is a question we'll come back to. As we expose the corner of the moat that you just saw moments ago, in the very early stages in 2001, we discovered right here at the very top a collection of sherds, and among them a jar handle with the name Ankh-Khepru Re. Ankh-Khepru Re has been identified with various Amarna figures as one of the short-lived successors of Akhenaten. Some identify this with Nefertiti herself, others with Smenkhare, a male successor. Whoever Ankh-Khepru Re was, we have some pretty good evidence for him or her in our military establishment. So the very fact that this is found in the intended fill at the very top makes us think that this moat was intentionally filled sometime after, just after the Amarna period. Further down, as we came towards the bottom of the moat, we found a stamped jar handle with the name of Akhenaten on it. So it's very clear that this fort, that the moat of the 18th dynasty fort was in use well into, if not through, the Amarna period, and somehow at the very end of the Amarna period is when it was filled in. The pottery as well as the stamped jar handles would seem to confirm this. So it seems that what happened was some sort of flood occurred, the back of the fort was wiped out, thus the fort was compromised and a new fort had to be built. And the backfilling was an intentional one to fill the moat in order to help construct the second fort. And so it would appear that this fort was in use into, if not through, the Amarna period. Sometime during the Amarna period, it may have gone damaged. And again, the exact chronology here is a little bit iffy, but somewhere in the Amarna period, this fort went out of use. But the second fort was immediately built in its place. And you can see here on the one area where the two forts overlapped, this was the area that was intentionally filled in to accommodate the new Ramesside fort. Here you can see the walls of the Ramesside fort and field, what we call field 4, is almost impossible to discover because the area had been a lot of rain, and due to the construction of the As-Salam Canal, there was a lot of plowing and bulldozing going on, and most of the fort was destroyed. But we saw the shells, which said, could these be brick? Started troweling, and sure enough, bricks began to appear, and we have this 4-meter wide wall. The southwest corner revealed a tower and the 3 different building phases. You can see the tower here in both pictures in green. And this tower was cut into a second wall, which was actually the first earlier tower. There's 2 phases to the second fort. And then the red arrows point to the wall that represents the top of the red brick moat from the 18th dynasty. So we have a nice chronological development here of the architecture. And of course, dating the first phase of the fort and the second phase of the second fort, we have proposed that the second fort may have been actually constructed by by Horemheb after Akhenaten's reign, and that the second fort was built by none other than Ramses II. So we'll show you more of that in a moment. Here is the walls of the fort on the other side of the modern irrigation canal, and you can see some of the damage here done by the canal makers with their bulldozers and front-end loaders. And you can see how little of this footprint of the fort has actually survived. In this corner, the north eastern corner, we're actually at the very bottom brick. I mean, there's no brick underneath that. That's how little has survived, but we at least have the footprint of the fort. It's about 75 meters by 75 meters. Here's where it turns and heads north up to the top where the city gate was located. So here we are, the 2 forts, one, and the Ramesside fort, the 2 purple marks designate where we actually found 2 incomplete moats. Now, as for the dating of this and for putting this all together, and what I'm trying to argue is that we have a complete sequence of the Amarna period represented here. This particular blue painted so-called Amarna ware, which actually has 3 hieratic Nefer signs here, means it's triple good wine, top quality stuff. Sometimes you get a single Nefer sign on wine jars, sometimes 2. Here we got a 3-fer. And according to Colin Hope's study, these type of jars were specifically wines associated with the Jubilee, the Hebsed of Amenhotep III. So what this means is that during the reign of Amenhotep III, The soldiers at this fort were well cared for, provided for nicely with wine to celebrate the Hebsed. In the cemetery area, we found a steatite ring of Queen T. It was found just outside of this tomb. Whether that's where it originated or not, we don't know. So we have clear evidence from Amenhotep III and Queen T. Mention has already been made of the Akhenaten jar seal. In field 2, we discovered a rather unique feature. It's a stone cistern. I call it a cistern. Greg Mumford, who excavated it, called it a well, and take your pick. But notice the steps going down into the stone-lined pit are talatat blocks, the kind of blocks uniquely used by Akhenaten in his temples. And there are talatat all over the place. Here's one, here's another. Others were found. I think in all we pulled out more than about 20 talatat blocks from this stone-lined pit. All this suggests to us that there had been a temple of Akhenaten either on site or nearby, but the very fact that we have all that crushed limestone tossed into the moat at the very end of the Amarna period might suggest that the temple had been on site and that it was demolished either by Tutankhamun, who did some demolition, or more likely Horemheb in connection with the building of the second fort. We'll come back to the stone-lined pit in a moment. Just to show you further evidence of talatat blocks, again, the unique signature stone of Akhenaten's building at both Karnak and Amarna. What you're looking at here is the walls of another moat. This is the one associated with the Ramesside fort. It's been largely demolished, and you can see talatat block in the foundation. And when we cut a section through the moat, you can see more talatat blocks used in the foundation. So clearly, post-Amarna construction, utilizing the leftover recycled Akhenaten temple blocks. This is inside the north side moat of the Ramesside fort, and you can see it's lined with stones and mud brick. And the most exciting discovery, or one of the most exciting discoveries in the foundations, are these door lintels. In all, there were 7, but I chose these because these 4 all have Amarna iconoclasm, Atenist iconoclasm, hacking out the name of Amun. And this, of course, is in the name of Amenhotep II. And all, there were 7 such lintels with Amenhotep III's name on, Amenhotep II's name on it. And they must have been in a building associated with the first fort and recycled and used in the second fort. In the gate area, more talatat blocks were found here in the foundation, the only 3 blocks in situ from the gate of the Ramesside fort. And once again, you see the characteristic 52 centimeter long blocks by 25 by 26, namely 1 Egyptian cubit by a half cubit. Here in the plan, you can see the talatat blocks and a couple more loose blocks for good measure in the courtyard area of the gate. The gate area was littered with smashed stones of various sort, and I think we collected over a dozen with the cartouche of Ramses II on it. But we also found 2 with with Merneptah's name on, which was exciting to see. Merneptah had also been there and probably added his name to his father's gate facade. This is one of the more interesting ones we found, with Ramses II's cartouche superimposed over an Aten disc from a talatat block. So again, all signatures of Akhenaten's temples and iconography. And one more intriguing little piece from the gate area is this very Amarna looking royal figure wearing a cap crown, yellowish goldish crown. And together with Earl Ertmann, who studied the ear and all these little details, suggested, based on parallels, that it might be Ankhepru-Re, or one of the immediate successors of Akhenaten, on one of these, on a talatat that was flaked off. Now, continuing to fill out the who's who of the Amarna period. This is a jar handle, again, an amphora handle. And I've given you two different views of it because each one shows you details the other one does not. But the inscription reads Nefer Nefru Aten, a title that Nefertiti assumed after the move to Amarna. Ankh en Hes, a Nefru Aten who is beneficial to her husband. Now, according to Mark Gabold, who has studied these and the first to really call attention to this, suggested that such a name would indicate almost a co-regency kind of situation. So if this is Nefertiti, this is Nefertiti in a co-regency capacity or some other Amarna royal lady, but this would signal something from the end of Akhenaten's reign. Now I return to that stone-lined pit, and here you can see Greg Mumford, who excavated his reconstruction of that stone-lined pit. But I bring you back here because we found two cartouches of Tutankhamun. Here on a jar handle with the reading Neb Khepru Re. And here on the bottom of an amphora, another Tutankhamun seal impression, again, Neb Khepru Re. We'll come back and talk about this one at the very end. Elsewhere in field 6, we found this jar handle with the name of I on it, Khepr Khepru Re, with the cartouche for, or with the hieroglyph for Hut, temple, right down here. So it's the temple of I. So again, we see we're going right through Amarna period. We're now down to I. And we also have three different occurrences of the name of Horemheb, two on seal impressions that once sealed papyrus documents. These are bullae, and if you turn them over, you can seal the impression of the string that tied up the papyrus, and also the bezel of a steatite ring with Horemheb's name on it. It's my suggestion that it was perhaps Horemheb who, in keeping with what he did elsewhere, demolished the Aten temple that was in the area, used some of the blocks for construction, and some that were broken up and in the debris were used to fill the moat. But maybe it was he who then built the first fort, the first phase that we saw, and then it would have been Ramses II who built the second phase with the decorated inscribed walls. Now, one of the constant complaints of Akhenaten was in the Amarna letters that he was being called upon to send goodies to various city-states. He was called upon to send archers and chariots and so on as things were getting a little bit out of hand, especially up in the north. One extremely exciting discovery was made not too long ago, and you're looking at it on the left and the drawing of it, in which you have a seal with several stamp cartouches of Akhenaten on it. And this came from the site of Katna. You can see Katna here on the map. It's just north of Kadesh. And it's worth noting that Amarna letters numbers 52 to 55 from Akizi of Karnak always asserts his loyalty to Egypt, and he's reporting on a Hittite proxy war against him by Itukuma, who was the king of Kadesh, and he had flipped from support for Egypt to support for Hatti. And so, again, we have a king, as many of them did, calling on Egypt for infantry, calling on Egypt for chariotry, calling on Egypt for gold and goodies. This find actually demonstrates that Akhenaten did send something to this king who was maintaining his loyalty. So rather interesting find what all was involved in this, whether it's just gifts or this was part of a gift that went with a military detachment. We cannot say for sure, but the fact that Akhenaten's name has been found this far north at a period when some disruption to the empire is underway, perhaps sheds a little more light on what was going on from an Egyptian perspective. Another interesting discovery that was made some years ago was a amphora seal impression again with the name of Ankh-Khepri on it, but this one was found at Tel Jerisha, which is just north of modern-day Jaffa, near present-day Tel Aviv. This was recently published by Orly Goldwasser, and she observes, this small find is yet another substantiating contribution to the Amarna Pharaoh, that the Amarna pharaohs kept hold on Canaan. The point of seeing these wine jars at these different locations implies that these are being sent by the king to either probably most likely for Egyptian soldiers, Egyptian administrators who are working to maintain the empire for Egypt. Now, this is an interesting discovery made by Eliezer Oren, along with several other stamped jar impressions, and this raining from the reign of Seti I. But what he found, and it's easier just to look at the drawing, was you have the cartouche of Men Ma'atre, Iri Peta, maker of heaven and earth, and a boat. And Goldwasser suggested that these little boat hieroglyphs on a number of the wine jar found in North Sinai, further to the west, not in our area, but further to the west, signify the presence of marine units, that there were soldiers attached to the forts in North Sinai, central and eastern Sinai, that were marine units that could work on land, or if called on, would jump on boats and head off on military campaigns. The significance of this to our study today is that if we go back to that seal of Tutankhamun's that was discovered in the cistern at Tel el-Borg, she subsequently pointed out to our publication that what we thought was a bad pair sign, a bad house sign, that this is the house of Tutankhamun, she sees the prow of a boat. And I believe she's right. In other words, we have a boat determinative at the bottom of the cartouche, signifying that this is a marine unit who is the recipient of the royal wine. And the very fact that this was discovered at Tel el-Borg suggests that during the reign of Tutankhamun, we not only had soldiers and a fort that was well equipped and well cared for by royalty, but we also had a marine unit attached to this site. Now, that significance becomes obvious when we go back and look at this area once again. Here, the same data that you saw on earlier maps now imposed looking east on a Google Earth image. You can see this Nile branch that goes towards the east, passes Tel el-Borg, and the green area is sort of the flood zone of this Nile branch that emptied into the Shihor Lagoon. So it's not surprising at all with this body of water, with this Nile branch, the body of water here that opens into the Mediterranean, that during Tutankhamun's day, there would be a marine unit attached to this site ready for military campaigns, because as we all know, every military campaign to Canaan or Syria involved land troops, but also involved an armada, a naval fleet that went along with it. My guess is with further excavations at the sites of Hebwa 1 and Hebwa 2, or Charu West and East, depending how you want to call it, that you'll find more evidence of this sort of naval operation, because you have the same situation here as you do at Tel el-Borg. Now, a closing comment or two about the wine. We have all these wine jars, and as I suggested, this is royal wine coming from royal vineyards and going to the soldiers and officers on duty at different forts. Charu is well known for a particular sweet wine. At Malkata, for instance, we have wine of Charu dockets, I should say, from years 28 and 36 of Amenhotep III. And we have year 13 Charu wine dockets at Amarna. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, we also have a wine docket, and I've given you the text of it here. It's dated to year 5. Sweet wine of Aten, and then we have a lacuna. So it's sweet wine that came probably from a temple or a temple estate of the house of Aten. And there are a number of these found in Tutankhamun's tomb, by the way. But this one's in Charu. See line 2, Charu. And then you have the name of the vintner, Penperamun. So clearly we are in the region right here in North Sinai near Charu where such wine was being produced. So no surprise that the soldiers closest to the action were getting in on this. And by the way, in KV 63, Otto Schaden discovered another year 5 wine docket from Charu. And for him, that was instrumental in tying the material from that cache that he discovered as part of the Tutankhamun burial, the year 5 of Charu wine. Now, in our excavations at el-Borg, our paleobotanist discovered amongst the seeds and different materials, biological materials that were found, also found grapes and grape seeds. Here you see a raisin and a grape seed. So very clearly, we had these beautiful vineyards somewhere nearby our site, and wine was being produced throughout the Amarna period, from Akhenaten's time all the way down through the time of Tutankhamun and I. Conclusions. Recent discoveries at el-Borg demonstrate that there was no break between this vital military establishment on the eastern frontier. Rather, there was continuity, and we can see that there was clear, fast determination to rebuild this fort when it was damaged, and that rebuilding happened at the end of the Amarna period. This was a very strategic area. It had to be maintained, but also, if you're going to have any military activity in Canaan or in further north into Syria or dealing with the Hittites, this zone of Hebel 1 and Hebel 2 and el-Borg all had to be functioning well for any military operations to take place further north. So the very fact that we have this continuity, even with the destruction of a fort, there is no discontinuity in occupation. So clearly this was an important place, and the 18th dynasty rulers knew it, the Amarna period rulers knew it, Akhenaten knew it, Tutankhamun knew it, and it was maintained. Supplemented by the discoveries at Tel Jarisha and Katna that I just showed you, the jar seals, it is clear that the economic and military presence persisted throughout the Amarna period. And these finds support the pictorial illustrations of battles and efforts to hold on to North Syria from the expanding power of Hatti. The loss of Kadesh was not due to Akhenaten's pacifism or indifference, I maintain. This happened because, for whatever reason, maybe the king of Kadesh saw that Hatti was going to win control of this area. We're not sure why he flipped, but he flipped. And I think that was a very decisive thing that worked against Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffmeier, for that presentation. Wonderful. I know that we will probably have lots of questions. So we'll now move into the Q&A portion. So please put your questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. And give me just 1 second and we will begin. One moment. All right, we have a question here from Sid. Hi, Sid. Hello. Some writers attribute all the soldiers depicted at Amarna as security forces or police. Does your research show they may have been regular army forces?
Yeah, I referred to Emmeline Healy's dissertation, and she speaks of both, that yes, there's a very strong police presence, and of course you have the tomb of Mahu, who is the chief of police at Amarna. And so definitely that was a very important part of, if you will, internal security. And at the same time, of course, you have the army that is more concerned with the external security of Egypt. So I think we have both. It's not an either or.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, the next question. Does continuity of the forts necessarily mean continued military activity, or could it be the equivalent of maintaining Cold War buffer zones during a period of relative peace?
Well, that's a interesting point. Of course, during the reign of Amenhotep III, when things were relatively peaceful, and it could well be that you simply maintained these places for all good reasons. Again, the big empires were not the only concerns the Egyptians had. They didn't like Shasu Bedouin. They didn't like bands of pastoralists coming in unchecked and so on. We can see that in a number of sources. So I would put it this way, that the presence of the forts across North Sinai, especially the frontier forts that we talked about today, that those may well have been exclusively frontier defense. But if you are going to launch campaigns beyond that, these had to be functioning fully. And from everything we can see, they were functioning fully. So it doesn't prove, but it certainly supports the pictorial evidence of international military activity under Akhenaten and under Tutankhamun, led by Horemheb, etc.
Okay. Let's see, our next question is from, let's see. What textual or artistic evidence do you have of naval involvements in campaigns to the north?
Well, beyond what I've introduced you today, explicitly from the greater Amarna period, I know we have pictorial evidence of boats from Tutankhamun's reign showing activity going in the southerly direction, the Tomb of Hui, I believe. But anything, especially from Amarna, I don't think we have anything like that. One of the scenes from that Ray Johnson found has a ship returning from a military campaign with a chieftain or a high-ranking military officer in a cage, and the cage is suspended from the boat, much like we read about in the earlier 18th dynasty of fallen kings being strapped to the prow of a boat and paraded down the Nile and so on. So there is those boat scenes in connection with Tutankhamun battle scenes from Western Thebes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, switching gears, another question. Are there any of these artifacts that you've discussed today in any museums that folks could see?
Yeah, well, as you all know, when the revolution took place, the storage rooms in North Sinai were to some degree looted. We know that some of our stuff was taken, I'm told, recovered, but we've never been allowed to go back out and do an inventory and see what's there or what's missing or that sort of thing. Much to my surprise, when I was at the Suez Museum a couple of years ago, I walked into the room that talks about mining and metal and so on, and I walked up to a case, and and there was this big long copper alloy sword and an even longer copper alloy lance blade. And I looked at them and says, I found those. So they were from el-Borg, but no labels. So I also understand that the Amenhotep II lintels that have the Amarna desecration on were designated to go to the museum at El Arish. But again, I don't know if that ever happened. So yeah, I can't speak to anything beyond those two things. But we have published them, so you can see all the pictures you want. The Jaap van Dijk joined me in publishing all the seal impressions at Journal of Egyptian Archaeology from 2010, and they're all in our excavation reports as well.
Okay. Some kind of a logistical questions, if you will. Someone is wanting to, I'm going to put two questions together. How many soldiers could the forts house? And another person says, I thought that workers were given beer. Were there any beer jars found or handles?
Lots of beer jars, of course, but beer jars don't have handles, or the so-called beer jars don't have handles. Wine, of course, would be for special occasions. And as in the case of the headset of the king, one would imagine that the amphorae that we found, those handles probably came from wine that was brought for special celebrations, special occasions. You're quite right, beer was the more daily beverage of choice. Regarding the size, of course, the number of soldiers in a military establishment depended on the size of the establishment. We had a chance find at el-Borg. It was a surface find discovered on the very first day of excavations. Our artist, Lila Pinch Brock, had me walk around the site with her foot flipped over a little small piece of limestone. And on the underside were 3 lines of text. And it was with Ramses II's cartouche on it. And it mentioned the SA, the military division. And this, so we know that at least in the Ramesside period, the fort was connected to the army of Amun. You know, in the New Kingdom, or at least the Ramesside era, there were 4 armies: the army of Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth. So the division of Amun was there, and then we have these smaller units called SAs, and a SA is made out of 250 soldiers and 3 senior officers. So that would suggest that we would at least have 250 military personnel at this fort, plus families and children. We found in the burials, we found the remains of women and children and so on. So families were living there in addition to soldiers. Now, the big question is, if you normally have 250 soldiers, when a military campaign comes along, how many of those join in on the campaign, and how many are needed to sort of maintain things while the campaign is underway? And we don't know those kind of logistics, but I would say based on that text, that's what we're looking at el-Borg, about 250. The fort was bigger, I think, during the 18th dynasty, but whether it had more personnel, we just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Susan would like to know, you have argued convincingly for continued military activity in the early years of Akhenaten's reign, but what evidence is there of such activity in the later years after the relocation to Amarna, when his monotheism might be regarded as more all-consuming?
Yeah, well, that's based largely on a second campaign that Schulman and Bill Murnane have written about, which Schulman dated to about year 15 of Akhenaten. And this is based largely on references in the Amarna letters, references in Hittite documents, which talk about Egyptian troops. And so it's largely based on that. It's not based on any particular group of scenes that we can date to that time. But so it's, yeah, this is, for Shulman, this was a collation of information that came from Amarna letters and Hittite documents.
Mhm. Thank you. Someone else is interested. Can you elaborate a bit on the activities in Kerma and Jebel Barkal?
Well, all I can say as regards to the Talatat, in fact, just 2 years ago when I was at Jebel Barkal visiting it, this is in the Kushite temple, and in the Kushite temple, built by Taharqa, maybe Pianki as well, that you have these Talatat blocks that are being used. Now, to my knowledge, I don't know of any, and I've visited the museum in Khartoum where any of the blocks were decorated. It's just the size of the blocks are there is also a toponym associated with this site, and it's called Gem-Aten. And Gem-Aten, of course, is a shortened form of the name Gempa-Aten, which was the name of the great temple at Karnak, and then Gempa-Aten is also the name of a temple at Amarna as well. So it appears that Akhenaten had built a temple in Nubia called Gem-Aten, following that same name formula. So in both cases, both at Doki Gel, Kerma, and at Jebel Barkal, these are reused. So where the original temples stood, how they were decorated, all that really is not known. And to my knowledge, if there are some decorated ones, I haven't seen them. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I just haven't seen them.
Thank you. Let's see, Franklin would like to know, what were the functions specifically of the moats that you showed? Were they defensive?
Yes, the moats were, yeah, it's really bizarre because we found evidence from 3 different moats. One on the north side around the what we call the public space, which is very strange. And it was in that we found the Amenhotep III triple Nefer wine jar. But yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think we can say the reason we have the fired brick used in the foundation is because of the high water table. And if you have a mud brick moat, the walls would collapse very quickly with the fluctuation of water levels, especially during the flood season. So the fired brick was to offset that possibility. The second moat that I showed you that had pieces of limestone, pieces of talatat in, that was just using scraps from the first fort and buildings that were demolished in order to make the second fort. So yes, it was defensive. We have virtually nothing of the enclosure wall of the 18th dynasty fort that survived. All we have is the moat. And that is due largely just to the fact that we were that far north, close to the Mediterranean in New Kingdom times. So you're getting a lot of rain up there. You got a lot of wind erosion. So you're not gonna, mud brick doesn't survive really well. The moat being subsurface, of course, survived quite well. So it was part of the defensive structure. I muse at the possibility that that it was part of the defensive structure, but it also compromised the first fort when water breached it from the Nile branch and began to undermine the foundations of the walls inside. So that's why the second fort, after somebody said, hey, let's make a moat, we found 2 segments of it, and then they stopped. It's like, maybe not. And they stopped building the moat. So its purpose clearly was defensive, working in cooperation with enclosure walls inside of them.
Thank you. See, Val would like to know, is there any chance the limestone infill could have been from a temple to the Aten, so an unwanted building post Amarna?
Well, that was my point. That's what I was suggesting, that there was an Aten temple in the area, and part of the demolition of the heresy of Akhenaten was the destruction of this temple. The very fact that we have the vineyards associated with Per Atum, the house of Atum, whether there was a temple and the vineyards were associated with this temple that had been in the area of Charu. Again, bear in mind, Tel el-Borg is only about 3 kilometers from the Chetem fort at Charu, so it's very close. In fact, 2 of the door lintels referred to gods of Charu on the blocks at Tel el-Borg, so there was a very close connection. So, yeah.
Okay. And Patricia, excuse me, is wondering, is the impressive level of fortification at Charu indicative of any local threat to the garrison forces there?
Yeah, well, I have to bear in mind that both Tel el-Borg and the Tel Hebwa forts not only guarded the road into Egypt from Canaan, but they also guarded the water way into Egypt by the Nile from the east. And so they're doubly significant strategically. As I used to say, if you're coming by land, it's you deal fort after fort, 1 if by land, but 2 if by sea, because you had forts on either side of the Nile and at Hebwa. And this is precisely the kind of defense system that was developed in the Middle Kingdom in Nubia to control the Nile. And they're doing the same thing in the north. So they're very important and had to be constantly prioritized, both for naval operations and overland operations. So that's why they're important. These 2 sites are especially important, and they're sort of twin sites working synergistically to defend Egypt's frontier. I have another lecture I've done for a couple of RC chapters in which I've suggested that Shihor, that lagoon, is where the great Sea People's battle took place, as they were trying to penetrate Egypt through the Nile branches, as the Medina Habu inscriptions tell us 4 or 5 times. They're trying to enter the Nile branches, plural. And at this point, from the lagoon, you have 2 Nile branches. And so that's clearly where the defense of Egypt is taking place. So in a sense, you could say the defensive systems at Charu and Tel el-Borg won out over the over the Sea People's attempted invasion of Egypt. But yeah, but that's another talk for another day.
Thank you. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Let's see. Would military leaders at these outposts maintain their defensive positions with or without the pharaoh's direct involvement?
It would be pretty hard to. Again, it's interesting how important the fortress of Charu is. Again, the Chetem and Charu, the Chetem forts, as Ellen Morris has shown, were the frontier forts that really guarded the strategic entrances to Egypt. So you have one in the north, you have one in the Wadi Tumilat at Tel el-Rataba, and these are main entry points. So they played a very vital role. And the very fact that you had high-ranking officers located there, interestingly, Horemheb at one point, Ramses I, had been commandant at the fortress of Charu. Ramses I was a general who became pharaoh. And so I think he and Seti I recognized, Seti would have grown up probably at Charu. And so they recognized future royals, how important that area was militarily. And so they weren't about to let that area slip in the future.
Thank you. And we have a clarification question just to go back over. Was the lagoon naturally occurring from the river branches, or it was man-made off the channels that were also man-made?
No, well, this whole area of North Sinai is part of what is called the Pelusium Line, which is part of a transatlantic shear that runs from South America across the Atlantic up through Africa and up the Red Sea and into this area. So this is a very seismically active area that formed some of these depressions that we know of as frontier lakes, the Balach Lakes, and so on. So, so the lagoon itself is a natural formation, and the coastline. Remember, I showed you the line on the satellite imagery. That coastline, we actually did carbon-14 dating of some of the shells in it, and it shows that that was functioning going way back to early dynastic and earlier times. So you have this coastal ridge, and any place, I guess, the Nile had to flow under it, and if it was able to penetrate and cut through, then it could flow out to the Mediterranean. If not, it's going to find these low depressions, and so the lagoon itself had an opening to the Mediterranean. Now, by the time you get to the late period, that has all changed. And this is what I've been doing my recent work on, showing how the road system actually changed between the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period. And we can see that both archaeologically and geologically. So, but no, the lagoon is a natural phenomenon. But as the Nile Delta builds out and the Pelusiac branch moves north, the water stopped draining into this lagoon area sometime in the first millennium, and everything changed in that region.
Okay. And I think this last question is a good one to end on. Are you planning any new excavations anytime soon?
Well, not in North Sinai, sadly. I wish I was able to work there, continue. There's much more work to be done. But no, my future plans to work with my colleague Piers Paul Cressman at Nuri in Sudan. So that's sort of where I'll hang up my trowel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we do have a transcript of them, and we can send them to Dr. Hoffmeier as well for his consideration. And I wanted to thank you, Dr. Hoffmeier, for your presentation today. It's so wonderful to have you with us. We had hundreds of people from all over the world. I was seeing in the chat when everybody said hello. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for everybody who tuned in. Please visit rc.org to see our full events calendar so you won't miss another upcoming virtual lecture. Again, our next RC special edition lecture is on April 10th. So we look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you again to Dr. Hoffmeier. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening, afternoon, night, whatever time it is where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.